Okay, class. In this screencast, we're going to look at some information from. We're still in VUS6. Actually, this is VUS6c, about midway through. We're looking at some reasons why James Madison asked Congress for a declaration of war against Great Britain in 1812, and why this request sort of divided the nation. So, in short, this is about the War of 1812. The war was fought between the years 1812 and 1814. It's called the Second War with Great Britain, also known as the Second War for Independence. So the United States is going to be at war with Great Britain here during these years. I wanted to give you a little bit of background that might help you understand this, because in the notes we really just kind of skim over the War of 1812, and it's important for a couple of reasons. One, it's really going to be the first time we're going to see American nationalism on the rise, and it's going to be in the face of a conflict with Great Britain, our second one. And number two, and it's a little more subtle, I think, we're going to have the roots of our industrial revolution, really, I think, here in the War of 1812. And that is going to come as a result of some things Jefferson did as president, which is ironic because Jefferson was all about the farmer, if you remember, all the way back to our discussions before about anti-federalists and Democratic Republicans and who supported them. So backing up a little bit here, Jefferson, won the election of 1800. Well, he's going to be reelected in 1804. And remember, he's a Democratic Republican. After selling Louisiana to the United States, France is going to turn its attention to Great Britain. The French military is led by Napoleon. He's a great military leader for France. And he is going to begin military operations against Great Britain after the sale of Louisiana Purchase, so after 1803. France at the time had a mighty army, and it controlled, in fact, arguably it probably had the strongest army in Europe, maybe the world, and it controlled the European continent. But Great Britain, its rival, controlled the seas. Great Britain had the strongest navy in the world. The United States, we didn't really have a strong navy or a strong army. In fact, Jefferson didn't too much like standing armies and navies, so I think he really cut the budget on both. And we didn't have much of an army or a navy in the early 19th century. In 1806, Great Britain is, well, let me back it up a little bit. Great Britain before 1806, Great Britain and France are kind of at odds. They're having they're having a war. They're battling one another. The United States is sort of in a unique position to trade with both Great Britain and France. So while these two countries are at war with one another, the United States is actually in a really good position to profit nicely by selling each country the things that it needed, mainly American raw materials, things like masts made from tree trunks, strong, tall, straight pine tree trunks, pitch and tar and rope and those kinds of things, and also agricultural goods and cotton. So we're in this position to sell and profit from our trade with both countries. So we're kind of in a good position here. But in 1806, Parliament in Great Britain issued something called the Orders in Council. And it was an effort to really sort of shut down French access, or France's access to American raw materials, or to any raw materials. So what it did was it closed all European ports under French control to any foreign shipping, including American, unless the foreign ships first stopped into a British-controlled port, and I think paid the British port some kind of tax, and then they could go on wherever they wanted, and they wouldn't be harassed by the British Navy. So foreign ships had to stop into a British ship or to a British port first, pay the tax, and then they can continue on and trade with France or whoever they wanted. France retaliated. France was pretty upset by this, and France retaliates by seizing all commercial ships docked in British-controlled ports in Europe. Remember, France controlled the land. Okay, there was the United States is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because, or maybe between the devil and the deep blue sea would be a better way to think of it, because there was no way for American merchant ships to conduct trade with one country without offending the other country. And the results could be deadly, literally. In addition to all of this going on, the British Navy is impressing American sailors. When I say impressing, I don't mean it like showing off. I mean impressment, like it's an early form of conscription. In other words, forcing people to serve in the military. And what the British Navy was doing was stopping American merchant ships and basically impressing the whole crew, or forcing American crews into the British Navy against their will. And sometimes this happened on the high seas, and sometimes it would you would get British agents coming into American port cities and taking men by force at night from their apartments or where they were staying, maybe taking them out of bars, wherever they could find them, and putting them on British ships. Between 1808 and 1811, about 6,000 Americans were impressed into British service. That's a significant number. And then in 1807, about 10 miles off Virginia's coast, a British warship overtook an American frigate called the Chesapeake, or just called Chesapeake was the name of the ship, and tried to remove 4 sailors. I think the captain of the British ship accused those 4 sailors of being British deserters. I don't remember, but what ends up happening is that the captain of the Chesapeake is going to refuse to give up these men, and the Chesapeake is a merchant ship at this time, if I recall correctly. So it's not well armed, but the British ship is a well armed warship. I might be wrong about the Chesapeake, but I'm pretty sure it's not well armed. But the bottom line is the British opened fire on the Chesapeake and damaged it badly, killed a handful of American sailors, and wounded a bunch of others. And I think they got their men, actually. They took their men off the ship and left the burning hulk of the Chesapeake out in the about 10 miles off the coast of Virginia. And it has to come back to port. Well, it makes it back to port. Okay, and it's quite a spectacle. People are coming out to see it. What happened? What's the story? And you know how news spreads, and it's up and down the coast. This story of British brutality on the high seas. News of the violation of American neutrality also spread quickly up and down the East Coast, and what followed was a dramatic upwelling of nationalism in the country. And we're going to see the wrath of our nation turn against Great Britain. In other words, when I say an upwelling, I mean we've got nationalism is this belief that your country is it's like extreme patriotism. It really is the way I think of it. But it's like your nation above all others. Well, when Great Britain attacked us, it caused that upwelling of nationalism in our country like we hadn't seen since probably the American Revolution. And we're going to have a call for war against Great Britain. But Jefferson, as president, wants to avoid war. So he comes up with an idea to try to affect change through trade. So he pushes through Congress something called the Embargo Act of 1807. And if you remember probably from your other history classes, an embargo is really a refusal to trade or a refusal to conduct business with someone. So this Embargo Act of 1807 would prohibit American companies, American merchants, from trading with either Great Britain or France. And since both countries relied on American raw materials, the idea was to kind of force them to respect American neutrality by not trading with them. I mean, it seems like a pretty sound idea. Unfortunately, it failed. Great Britain and France simply found their raw materials elsewhere. And what we have back here in America is a loss of the ability to trade, even worse than before the embargo. So we have New England ports are going to be packed with raw materials ready to go out and nowhere to go. And in the South, crops are not going to be shipped overseas. So we have a serious slowdown in trade, a serious negative economic impact because of this embargo. And it's going to cause resentment. Remember, I said earlier that Jefferson's a Democratic Republican. Well, in New England is the stronghold of the Federalists. So those ports, those merchants up in New England are going to be mostly Federalists, and they're going to be very, very, very upset with Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans because of this embargo. But despite their hardships, their economic hardships up in New England businessmen and entrepreneurs are going to focus really their attention on trying to salvage something of their economy, and so they start developing manufacturing. They start developing textile mills to take American cotton and weave it into fabric. And this new focus on manufacturing is really going to sort of lead our country into an era of industrialization that will turn America into an economic powerhouse lasting well into the 20th century. I don't think Jefferson intended that. Again, if you remember, Jefferson was all about the farmer and the artisan and the craftsman. He really wasn't big business, big manufacturing. But the Embargo Act is going to force New England to look harder at manufacturing, and it's really going to propel the United States economically into the 20th century. Okay, so that's not something we often talk about when we talk about the War of 1812, but that's where this is all part of it, I should say. Meanwhile, one of the other causes of the War of 1812 had to do with Americans trying to expand into that area that. That Trans-Allegheny West area, up in places, across the mountain range into places like Indiana and Ohio, places like that. As American settlers were streaming into those areas, hoping to find land to farm and a place to set up a home, they oftentimes ran into to Native Americans who had been living there. Many of them had been pushed out of the East 100, 200 years earlier, and they were settled into these areas west of the Alleghenies. And so hostilities break out. Indians are going to attack settlers. Settlers are going to attack Indians. There's lots of death, lots of violence, lots of conflict. Word gets out east of the mountain range, back in the eastern cities, the Bostons, the New Yorks, the Philadelphias, and wherever. And the belief is that, or at least the rumor is that Great Britain has been in the market of buying American scalps, and that these Indians are taking scalps and selling them to the British. I don't know if there was ever any truth to that or not, but the bottom line is that the hostilities between settlers and Indians were growing, and it was probably pretty accurate to believe that the British were at least inspiring those attacks and probably supplying the Indians with the weapons they needed to make them happen. So that interruption or that interference with westward expansion is going to be another cause of the war. That whole part of this, the whole westward expansion interference thing, is going to culminate in what we call the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, where Indiana militiamen are going to be led by the governor, William Henry Harrison of Indiana, and he is going to defeat, or his men will defeat a Shawnee Indian and his warriors, known as the Prophet. At least that's what the settlers called him. His Indian name, I'll try not to slaughter it, was Tenskwatawa, and he was actually, I think, the brother of Tecumseh. So this famous Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811 is going to kind of be the turning point, I guess, in this westward expansion. The conflicts that were coming out over westward expansion. So to rehash all this, and it's all very important, but to rehash it and to summarize it, I should say, the causes of the War of 1812 are going to be British interference with American shipping and British interference with westward expansion. Some of the results, or one of the political results of the War of 1812, will be the breaking up of the Federalist Party. If you remember, I told you that the Federalists opposed the embargo that Jefferson had pushed through Congress and Congress had enacted because it was stifling trade in the region. The Federalists are going to threaten to secede or to leave the Union, to take New England out of the Union, and start their own country up there. Talks of secession were all over the place. And New England even is going to try to propose some constitutional amendments to try to alleviate the problems they're having up there, but nothing was acted on. After the war is over, the Federalists, like I said, are going to break up. They're going to kind of go away. People are going to be very upset with them because they seem to be unpatriotic. They lose a lot of supporters. Many of their many former Federalists are going to go into other political parties, maybe the Whigs, maybe another group called the Know Nothings, which we'll talk about later. And that's kind of going to be the end of the Federalists. Okay? All right, so that should pretty much tidy up the War of 1812. Email me if you have any questions, and I will see you in class.